apart from the advantages I mentioned in the previous videos about smart objects, there's one last very important addition, and that is if you use filters on smart objects, they will become smart filters. Now, since Creative Cloud, you can even use adjustments, and those will also become smart filters. But let's just first see how we use a filter. Well, you just simply go to the filter menu and then choose the option from here. We can maybe sharpen this image slightly, so we can go to sharpen and then choose smart sharpen and then dial in the values we want. We can already see before and after. It's okay, it's slightly better. It's not perfect, but maybe make it a bit stronger just to make it obvious. Something like that, maybe even the radius. I will intentionally overcook this, so I'm going to click OK, and you can see that the filter has been applied. Now, if I don't like the filter, or if I want to adjust it, I can't do it because I applied it directly on the background layer. Remember what I said, this is a destructive way of using Photoshop, so we should turn this layer into a smart object before we apply filters on it. So I'm just going to undo this last step, go back to the original version, and then I will right click on the layer and choose Convert to Smart Object. Once I have that, now I can go back to the filter menu, and if I want to use the last used filter, I can just select it from the top of this menu. That will apply exactly the same settings, so I can just click OK, and now what happens is that this filter will become a smart filter which is editable at any point later on. So I can turn it off with the eye icon or turn it back on, and I can even double click on Smart Sharpen and access the settings I used. So if I feel like it's too much, I can reduce it, click OK again, and it will update. We can also use this mask, which is the Smart Filter mask, in which if I use, for example, the brush with black as my foreground color, I can paint over the details where I think I don't need the adjustment. If I paint with white, I can reveal the adjustment again. So just like showing and hiding details, here we are showing and hiding the effect, which is the Smart Sharpen filter. If we like the effect, we just want to tone it down or maybe even use it with a blend mode, we can double click on this icon here, which will take us to the blending options for that smart filter, where we can reduce the opacity to tone it down, or we can also apply blend modes on it, which will give us a completely different result. Of course, in this case, I don't want to do that, but sometimes that can be also useful. I'm just going to click on Cancel, and I will show you that you can also remove a smart filter if you don't want to use it anymore. You can just right click and choose Delete Smart Filter, and then it's gone. So let me show you on this image a better way of sharpening this image. Although Smart Sharpen is good, and there's also a couple of other options like Unsharp Mask, which is also good. If you have the Creative Cloud version, you will also have the Shake Reduction option under Sharpening, and that's my favorite one. If I select that one, I will show you that it automatically recognizes how the camera was moving while I took this picture. Here, I can even see the angle in which my hand moved while I was taking this picture. And based on that movement, it does a much better job at sharpening it. Now, I could go in to make all the other changes here as well, but for now, I'm just going to click OK. And we can see before and after. So that was before, this is after. I think it's much better than any of the other sharpening techniques. But I could still decide not to sharpen the background, so I can select the mask, use the brush tool, and just paint over these details with black, with a big black brush, something like that. You can see how we remove the sharpening from it, or the shake reduction, because that's not really an important detail. We want to focus on her. The same thing goes here on the right. We can remove the shake reduction from that. So if I now turn it on and off, that was before, this is after, it's only applied on the little girl. If I want to make changes to the filter itself, I can double click on it and I can access all the options here. Now let me show you another example similarly to this one. We go back to our previous image or combination of images. And let's say I want to blur the background out. So I want to reduce the depth of field, and I want the mountains in the background and also the balloon to be more blurred out. Just like sharpening, blur is another option we can use from the filter menu. But once again, I will use it as a smart filter. And I actually would like to combine these three layers, the balloon, the retouch, and the background layers. Instead of merging them, I right click on all three while all three are selected, and then I convert them into a smart object. That will merge them into one layer, but if I double click on the thumbnail of it, that opens up the source file, which will still have all the layers separately, and it even kept the balloon as an additional smart object. So that's just an example. You can also create smart objects within smart objects. So it's a multi-level embedding in this case, but I didn't want to change the source, so I just close that. Instead, I have the smart object layer selected here, and I will just call this background. So now I can go to the filter menu, and another one of my favorite filters is the blur gallery. And out of this, you can choose different options, but what I like to use is the tilt shift, especially for these type of examples. So as I said, I want the foreground to be in focus and the background to be blurred out. So I'm going to drag this line down, which extend the sharp details all the way to the bottom, like that. And then I'm going to drag this one down exactly where I want the blur to start. Of course, we can increase the amount as well, and we can find that here on the right side. So we can increase the blur, or also just drag this line up or down and see how quickly it blurs everything out. I prefer to keep it really high just so I can see what I'm doing. So I definitely don't want to use it on the bottom. I only want it in the background. And we can change the gradient or the fall off by dragging this dashed line. If I keep it very close, it will be a very abrupt change. But if I drag it further up, then it will be a more gradual change in the blur. Also reduce the blur because I didn't want to overdo it. Something like that I think works really nicely. So we can always turn the preview off to see before, turn it back on to see it after, and you can also keep the high quality option on to see a better version of the blur. So once again, that was before and that is after. But if I click OK, I will see that all these settings are now saved within the smart object. So it's there as a smart filter. We can always turn it off, turn it back on easily, and we can even mask it. And by double clicking on it, we can access it to make changes. So just to try this out, I'm going to select the girl and go to Filter, Blur Gallery, and I will choose Field Blur, which is just a simple blur. It applies on the whole selected layer. And you can see we can create a very strong blur on the girl if we want. I'm going to use the high quality option on this as well. So once I click OK, we can see that will also be another blur gallery option on that other smart object, which again, we can turn off if we want or turn it back on. So with this, we can achieve an effect where we only have the elephant in focus and both the foreground and background are blurred. If we feel like the foreground blur is too strong, we can always double click on it and reduce the blur like that. Let's click OK. And you can see the flexibility and the advantage of using smart filters. And what's even better is that we can stack up multiple filters on the same smart object. So for example, we can add the reduce noise filter on this image with the girl. Let's just zoom slightly closer. Although we blurred it out, we might still want to use that. So if I go to filter, noise, reduce noise, and then whatever option we select, we can click OK, and then that will be also applied, and you can see it here in the stack. So we can turn it off or turn it back on individually. Now, because of the blur, we can't really see much difference there. But what I mentioned in the beginning of this video is that if you use Creative Cloud, you can even use all the adjustments as smart filters as well. So although they are not filters, they can still double as a smart filter on smart objects. So for example, we can choose shadow highlights, which is a brilliant adjustment. Once I select that, we can see the effect of that. but let's just reduce the shadows. I didn't want to increase it that much, and also increase highlights. Let's say something like that. Once I click OK, you can see the effect of this clearly on the image. But if I feel like I lost a bit of contrast, I can also add another adjustment and then choose levels, with which we can increase the contrast back and increase the brightness as well, like that. So once again, without and with the levels, if I click OK, now we can have a look at the whole image. So this is how it looks with all my filters and adjustments, but everything is stacked up here as smart filters. So I can turn all of them off or back on, and I can even turn them on and off individually. So if I feel like I don't need the blur gallery anymore, I can just turn it off and see the result. And then I can even turn off reduce noise if I want to. So now I only have levels and shadow highlights on the girl. But here is another example on which the bokeh effect will work perfectly. So if I go to filter, blur gallery, tilt shift, I will be able to set it up exactly where I want it. So I just drag the center point a bit down, something like that. And then I'm going to reduce the amount of the blur up to there. Actually, I want to keep these in sharp, and then I just drag that one down. Let's increase the blur. So I want to really blur out all the details on the top, and you can already see what the effect I'm after. So there on the top we can see the little circles, but if I increase the light bokeh, you can start to see them even better. That is what I wanted to achieve, but we can also have a bit of more blur here in the foreground, and that's a tilt shift effect when we have a very shallow depth of field and then quickly turns into a very blurred out detail. But of course we can increase the intensity of them, or the color on them we can also increase, and then when we are happy with the result we can click OK. And of course everything is non-destructive, so we can always make changes, but generally that was before and that is after. So as a last example, let me show you another favorite filter of mine, which is also under the filter menu. It's called Camera Raw Filter. Unfortunately, this is also another CC option, so you won't find it in previous versions. Of course, you can work with Camera Raw files in previous versions, but you don't have the Camera Raw as a filter. Now, the reason why I like this, because even if the file that I opened is not a Camera Raw file, I can still use the same settings on it. Now, if you are not familiar with Camera Raw files, I'm going to explain that in more detail in another video. But for now, let's just first convert our layer to a smart filter and then apply this filter on it. Notice that we also have the option here, so we can choose Convert for Smart Filters, which automatically turns it into a smart object, and then we can choose the Camera Raw filter. So once I select that, we can now add a couple of options. One of my favorite one, which I use, and that's also only in CC, is the dehaze option. And look at that, how much better immediately the image looks. So by increasing dehaze, we add so much more contrast, color, and everything just looks better with this option. So let's see before. By pressing P on the keyboard, I can see before and after. So that's a huge improvement. And it actually acts as multiple effects in one. Just by using the dehaze, then we can go back to the basic panel. We can increase the shadows to see a bit more detail on the darker parts. We can reduce highlights to reduce the brightness on the sky. We can add clarity as well to add even more sharpness and contrast, increase vibrance to have even more colors, and maybe overall we can add a bit of more exposure just to brighten up the overall image. So now if I press P, that was before, and this is after. Massive difference. All done quickly in Camera Raw filter within Photoshop. So if I click OK, the best thing is because we use the smart object, all this is actually non-destructive editing, so I can always access the Camera Raw filter by double-clicking on it, or I can turn it off, turn it back on, and if I feel like I overcooked it, I can double-click on the blending options as well, and then just reduce the opacity here. That way we can find a good balance between before and after. As I said, if you're not familiar with the Camera Raw filter, I will talk a little bit more about that in another video. But in this course, we won't have time to go into detail and go through all the filter options from here. I will come back to some of them, like the Liquify filter. But if you are interested to learn more about these, I'm going to have a course specifically on Photoshop filters. But this is all that you need to know about Smart Objects. In the next video, we will take a closer look at how to work with adjustment layers, our other very important part of the Photoshop non-destructive workflow. And in the videos after that, we will go through some of the most important adjustment options.